好，那 Jessica Cheng 是 Set-Out Studio 的艺术总监。好，那他们的作品 Viewfinder 是一个非常独特、有视觉非常独特视觉风格的解谜游戏。那他们的游戏在设计上面跟这个视觉表现上面，其实整合的非常的这个漂亮。那如果有玩过的朋友，应该就会知道我在讲什么。啊，今年也在这个台北电玩展，2024年台北电玩展，在这个 Indie Game Award 有获得最佳游戏的殊荣。那我们就以热烈的掌声来欢迎 Jessica Cheng 从加拿大我们远端演讲，谢谢。
Hi, good morning, everybody. Thank you for showing up today. Unfortunately, I'm not able to be here in person due to circumstances, but I really want to thank the TGDF team for making this remote thing happen. So, yeah, let's start. So, just a bit of an intro about me. I spent more than like 10 years in games doing a bunch of various things. There's a mix of like indie titles and AAA titles and animation and stuff like that. And here are some caveats for this presentation. So I work mostly in the Western world. I mostly have AAA experience, even though I've done a bit of indie work here and there. A lot of the opinions and perspectives here are like my own, so I may not apply to you, but hopefully everybody will be able to learn something from it. Yeah, so like for art direction, brief introduction before we start. This is Viewfinder. It's a first-person puzzle exploration game. So the main mechanic of this game is you take a picture and you place it in the world, and creating like a new 3D environment, and then you're able to interact and move around in this new 3D environment that you created. Also, like there's going to be spoilers for the games ahead, so if you haven't played, sorry, there's nothing I can do about that. So yeah, like when a lot of people like talk about art direction, there's a lot of really complicated terms or things that are trying to be distilled down in maybe a more complicated way. But for me, I find that the simplest way to describe this is that I'm trying to capture like a specific vibe or feeling that I want like my team and the audience to experience here. And at the bottom, I added I'm trying to capture this like distinctive feeling or quality of capable of being sensed through visual imagery and sounds. So always be good friends with your audio team, because sound really adds a lot to what you're trying to portray here visually. And then like from here, there are like a number of ways that, from what I observed, that games do this. So like one of the ways is through like a thematic approach. So for example, like on the game on the left is called a word game. I've not played this game, but it has been introduced to me by a friend. So what this game does is that it uses a lot of Chinese characters to describe the objects, like the items and the narrative in the game. So for example, like the character road, it's being used to describe like the actual road in the game, and they're using actual like Chinese characters to describe the narrative of the game as well. So that's what's called word game. So in this case, they're using like the inherent qualities of like Chinese characters to create the visuals of their game world. And on the right is a game called Exit 8 that you might have played or known of. It's literally a copy of a Japanese subway station, and they're using like the inherent qualities and elements of a Japanese like subway station. Like it's feeling like when it's empty, it can feel a bit unsettling and create like this sort of liminal atmosphere. And that's the sort of like gameplay that you're also going through when you're experiencing a lot of odd things that are happening in this like subway station as you're trying to escape. So these are two like the more really straightforward examples of what a thematic approach could be in a video game. This is from the image on the left is from Alan Wake, the dark place section. So the key inspiration for this area is the classic hard-boiled detectives in the noir genre. So they're capturing like a lot of like high contrast, very minimal lighting, very very moody. And those sort of elements are usually like frequently depicted in like the movies or the photographs that you could find from covering that genre. So even though I haven't watched many like classic noir movies, I would believe that the team has done like their research and like done a lot of in-depth like look into like what actually makes this like a noir genre. Like how do we capture that? How do we like depict it visually? That sort of like atmosphere and the feeling and the vibe that they want for this particular area. So then I also saw like another talk that he did that this was actually inspired by New York City. So obviously there's going to be like more research into like what does this location look like like all the very specific things that make up New York City, like the grime, the crime, the leather jackets, like all those sort of things. And the game on the right, probably a lot of you might recognize. It's Cyberpunk 2077. So by now, I would believe that like cyberpunk is a really like well-tread genre. Like everybody knows what cyberpunk is, but if you think about it, it's like, how do you know it's cyberpunk? Like you look at it and you know it's cyberpunk, but why? So if you try to break it down a bit, these are some of the common like elements that you can be seen there on the slide. Like those are some of the common elements that make up cyberpunk. And if you see like a combination of those elements, as an audience, you can immediately assume that it is probably related to cyberpunk or related to something in that genre. But if you go back a bit further, a lot of the classic films like Akira or Ghost in the Shell, they're visually inspired by Hong Kong, and in particular, they're inspired by the Kowloon Walled City. So this is like a densely populated, like largely ungoverned, illegal like settlement or buildings that cropped up. And the people there, because they were ungoverned, they actually had their like, they created like their own norms and culture, like their own way of living that is largely very different from what mainstream Hong Kong was at the time. So if you think about it even further, like if you think about the word cyberpunk, right? Like the word punk itself is also a very like prominent subculture back in the 60s, and that likely influenced like a lot of the world building for the fictional media that uses the word cyberpunk at the time. So really what I'm trying to say is that it's usually worth it to dig in a bit deeper into the root of the thing that you're inspired by, because not only will you learn more and be better equipped to make better, more like creative decisions based on what you want to keep and change, but also like you get to understand like a bit deeper into the themes or like the movements that surround these sort of like the things that you're inspired by. Maybe that could spring something else that is unexpected. And then so these are like thematic approaches, like one sort of thing that people can sort of like rally their direction around. And then the other one that's a bit more common is that you have a theme and then they combine it with the art inspiration. So these are another like two pretty like straightforward like visual examples. Like Hades, the theme is Greek mythology, and the art style is like this black fill graphic style reminiscent of like comics or manga. So that's like that's sort of like their visual direction. And then the one on the right is like and this sort of like puzzle game where you have to build up like buildings and stuff. So the theme would be like like romanticized villages, like building like idealistic type countryside villages. But then the textures itself, they're like reminiscent of like brush paintings or like plein air paintings. So this is like usually, I guess this is like probably one of the more like common ways that people tend to how do they figure out their art direction, like how do they is usually like a combination of like themes and like the visual inspiration that they want to follow. And like maybe now you're thinking, well, like how do you do that, right? There's so many things. How do you decide? And this is perhaps like a framework that could be really useful when you're trying to think about or you're trying to figure out like what works for your game or what would you like for your game. So usually a lot of the bigger theme or like key elements, like for example Hades, the Greek mythology thing, that will likely have been decided by a lot of like your stakeholders, like the of your project. So that will give you like a pretty solid point, like a solid starting point to jump off of, and then from there you can sort of like think about any other like themes that you want to explore and how to break those things down. For example, like maybe, again, I'm going to use that example, like maybe you want to do like a cyberpunk game. So what makes up cyberpunk, right? Like what are the colors? What are the common colors? Like what are the common lighting? Like what kind of buildings? Like those sort of thing. There's a lot of like similarities with world building when you do this sort of thinking, but it really helps to inform like your artistic intent and like the authenticity of your intent. So like a lot of this is not about like blindly copying something. It's more like you're trying to learn more about the subject matter, so you're able to pick and choose the things that feel right for your game, or it feels right for what vibes you're trying to portray here. Like you want your team to understand what you want to convey, and you also want your audience to understand what you're trying to convey. But if you do this, and then so now you have a bunch of like elements, right? Like further down production, now you get to choose like which elements are more important to you visually for your game and like for the vibe that you're trying to convey. So that way you're able to have like greater creative control over your art direction, and then you're able to create like something perhaps that hasn't really been done in a while, like people haven't thought about it or have done it yet, but because you're able to isolate these things and think about like which elements are really important to you and which are the elements that you really want to like showcase or highlight in the art direction as like important emphasis. So these are the visual pillars for Viewfinder. They did on the left there. They did change a bit over the course of the project, but they haven't changed like too much. So sometimes pillars and things can change, if it doesn't really work out for the game that you're trying to do. But for most part, like the artistic intent that you want to make, that should not change too much, because that really affects the foundation of the project. So the image below is like the entire like ref depot that I put together for Viewfinder. Like I encourage people to add to it. Like everybody can look at it anytime they want. Like if they get stuck or they need inspiration, or they want to find something, they found something that's like interesting, they want to add it to the pot. Like it's all there for people to sort of like look at and like do that together. Yeah, and like, on top of like the media research, like we also on top of the image research, we also did a lot of like game research. So a lot of these are more like looking at what other people did to solve their problems in their games, and then we're looking to see if we can apply it to our game, or even if it's like appropriate for us, or even like a good idea for us to do that. So like one of the really obvious examples is like Portal, because it is pretty much the most famous example of like a first-person puzzle game. So we were looking at how did they guide the player to solve those puzzles. Mirror's Edge was also like a really was like one of the key games that we're looking at, because the art style still stands up today, even though it's like 1,000 years ago, I guess. It's because of the clear like graphic treatment, and like the way like it's very clear. It's not based on graphic fidelity. So that was also like an approach that we wanted to do. We didn't want to do something that was very heavily realistic, but we also didn't want to do something that's a bit too like low poly, just because at the time there were a lot of games doing a lot of like low poly, lo-fi type games, and we wanted like Viewfinder to stand out a bit visually. So we went like the semi-realistic route. So we were looking at a lot of these other like semi-realistic games, and like what buttons did he push, like do we want those things or not. And there was just like a lot of like visual testing to see what fit the pillars that we thought about, if they fit, if they looked like appealing at the end of it. So these are the first key art pieces I did for Viewfinder. The one on the left is really trying to capture like all the visual pillars that were like labeled and thought about in like a few slides back. And a lot of the exploration pieces on the right are like just experimenting with like different colors, or even like the vibrancy of like what the sky is, and like the saturation of the colors and the lighting. So this sort of piece is really useful really early on, because you're trying to cement like the vibe and the feeling that you're trying to share with the rest of the team. If they understand what you're talking about, if they're on board with this sort of like this look, or this again, this vibe that you're trying to get across in the game, and to see if the team understands your intent and they're on board. So a lot of these like really like high level key art pieces are really good to just sort of like cement the overall like visual goals for the game that you are trying to do. And then from here we kind of broke it down a bit more. So two of the key main elements of Viewfinder visually, it's concrete and foliage. Foliage really softens the concrete, and foliage also gives like indication of life. Like part of the goal for Viewfinder visually is that we wanted something to feel utopic, like very optimistic. We didn't want to do like a very dystopian or like very dull looking type of game, or anything that's like too dark. So foliage sort of adds to that. And then because we have a lot of foliage in the game, like foliage is one of the more important parts of it. We kind of broke it down to layers. So we have like probably 5 or 6 layers. I just listed some over there, but basically you start with the bottom layer, like the ground layer, like the grass or something, and then from there you kind of work your way up. You don't need all layers at once, but this helps like the team and the art team to kind of like visualize what they can add like per layer. Like if they wanted to add like large trees and stuff, they should probably have like grass and maybe like a couple of like mid-sized bushes, like stuff like that. From the concrete itself, like actually the main inspiration for the architecture was actually mentioned by our producer, our executive producer. So he mentioned like brutalism, and it actually worked out really well for what we want to do, because it's very simple, it's very straight edged. It's also used a lot in a lot of like dystopian type movies and entertainment media nowadays. So I thought it'd be interesting to sort of like flip it on its head and revert back to the original like utopia ideology that brutalism was actually used for. So like in post-war Britain, a lot of like this was actually thought of like a style how to build like a lot of like low-cost mass housing for people who are displaced by, I'm guessing, like the war. So together with like utopic ideals, so that was something that we were kind of like leaning towards when we were looking at that. But also like other than looking at like the Western world type of brutalism, we also looked at a lot of brutalism in tropical countries, because we have a lot of foliage. So we were looking at how in places like that, like how does like the plant life like coexist with a lot of these concrete pieces. So that was some of the more like specific reference we're looking at. And in addition to that, there was this really prominent like architect that we're looking at called his name is Ricardo Bofill. He's not strictly brutalism, but a lot of his stuff like is about like reusing spaces. So there's a lot of like concrete and like also like a lot of overgrown type stuff. So we were also looking at a lot of like his work. So if you're doing this game, there's a lot of different pieces to it, and part of it is, I can't really find a better word for it, but it's basically vibe consistency. So basically, you want to make sure everything in the game looks and feels like consistent, and like a tool to do that is form language, and it's really obvious to do that in the technology that you're going to be presenting in your game if you're having like any sense of technology. Technology is the easiest way that the audience will place somebody in a time period, or they'll place a media in a time period. Like if they see like certain furniture or like certain cars, and they already know like what era, like roughly what era this, the whatever the game or the show or whatever is being like placed in. So it's a really important like type of element to think about if you are going to include it in your game. So in this case, like we are Viewfinder is going with like retro future technology, but there's a lot of like different types of like retro future sci-fi. So I had to sort of define it a bit more precisely. So like the team knows like what is a part of this form language that I am defining for retro sci-fi and what is not our like sci-fi basically. In terms of sci-fi too, there's a lot of different types of sci-fi. So if you're doing this sort of like exercise, really helps to sort of like narrow down what you really want or what you really don't want for your sci-fi. And it could be any matter of things. Like this sort of thing is really good to keep consistent, and it's also good for you because now you have like a better understanding of what it is exactly that you're looking for in in like the world that you're trying to sell. Viewfinder has a lot of different art styles and photo filters. So a lot of the original, different art filters on the right here are actually already created by like the game director. Like they were there from the beginning. We already had like this sort of like inkling of exploring like, different art styles even from the beginning, and then later on we sort of like thought about incorporating them even more into like any of the photo filters that you encounter throughout the game, or it could be like unlockable like specials for people when they finish like, certain challenges or certain aspects of the game. A lot of the photo filters they're related to like physical media, so like blueprints or like sketching, or like you use like a photocopy machine, the filter will look like a photocopy. So a lot of these are trying to just like most of these are trying to describe like a physical media effect in a digital world, even though some of it is like mostly digital. Like we have the retro looking game that the pixel looking game that they're all pixels, like things like that. The UI that we have in the game, they're mostly inspired by a camera as well, because the game is about a camera. So a lot of it was inspired by like a physical camera. A lot of the FUI in the game, again, they're all diegetic. So they're all like related to the media that you are interfacing with. So for example, like in the main simulation, they're all like sort of this digital type of font. And then for anything else, like if you interact with a chalkboard, it looks like a chalk scratch. The Tomodachi type thing, it's a digital interface because it's like a copy of that digital little game. If you interact like with a real map, it looks like a real map, like so on and so forth. So those are just like some of the decisions that we made here for Viewfinder. And then like another like key part of art direction is also just like working with your narrative team. They're there on the right, like Son and D. So when they onboarded, we actually didn't have any characters, and no talk of any characters even started until I did this like random doodle there on the bottom right, and that kind of got like a lot of conversation started about like, well, who do we want, like how do we form a story, how do we wrap a story around this like game mechanic. So the characters came about. Forming characters in Kate, we have the 7 main areas, and we have the 5 chapters of the story in the game. So I made this sort of like palette image there in the bottom left to sort of figure out the transitions in the game, to show the player like, how do I show the player moving forward? How do I show the player like transitioning throughout the game? And because like most of the game is like a big open sky, like this sort of like dramatics, like the change of the colors in the sky, they have a really big impact. So so that was like a sort of like a bang for your buck kind of thing. But narrative also ended up using it to plot a lot of their characters. So that was like a surprise. So like the art that you make will ideally you have this sort of a collaboration going on with both like your narrative team or your design team with the art, so you're all able to like make something bigger than yourselves. This was the really early like version of Kate way back in like the prototype stage. Like we were thinking it to be more of like a glitch. So I was thinking like, okay, like, you know, code is made of 1 zeros, right? That's what computers read. And the inspiration are from these like really old Japanese posters that use their characters to describe the thing that they're talking about. But then when we onboard more people, like a lot of the talk came about to be like, you know, like, hey, what if we, you know, like, what if we had a cat, right? What if the cat's like cute and fluffy? We could have a cat. You know, our lead artist, like, you know, she can be a cat. Is like, it's no problem, right? And then, you know, you're thinking, right? You're thinking like, hey, it's just a cat, right? Everybody knows what a cat is, right? A cat is very straightforward, and you know, no, not. Communication is really important, and like even the simple subject matter of a cat shows that everybody has a different idea on their head. And like Easter eggs, we also have this image in the game because it was too funny not to use. So basically, what happened was what I thought a cat was, like, I went with the inspirations on like the left there, and then, you know, my lead artist went with something that was a bit more realistic, so she came up with the cat on the right. And then we had to have like a discussion about what the goals of the cat were, and like why do we need this cat to be like cute and fat and fluffy and all those things. And we just kind of like sorted it out that way. And then yeah, this is like pretty much the final version of Kate there in the bottom right. On the top left is basically like some of the initial effects I was playing around with for Kate. Because it is still a digital simulation, we had to I wanted to tie it back to, you know, having some sort of like glitchiness or like digital effect or something like that. But with this effect, it also kind of harkens back to the Cheshire Cat, which also serves is like as part of what Kate serves as is a role in the game. Initially, the effect covered like the entirety of the cat, but then we decided to minimize the effect on the face because most of the expressions are on the face, and we wanted the players to be able to read those expressions like a lot clearly. So these are the goals for Kate on the right there. Kate is the main way that you experience the narrative for this game. Kate is also like your companion, and like Kate will give you hints if you're stuck. Because it is a digital world, and because Kate is like your digital guide in this digital simulation, Kate can appear anywhere. Kate will always watch you, and because Kate's like wondering what you're doing here, basically. And Kate will also almost always like appear in random spots where you won't be looking. There's a lot of code involved to make sure all these things happen, but those are the goals for Kate for the game, and for the most part, I'm glad to say that they've been accomplished. Yeah, so when you're working in narrative as well, like usually comes to a point where you have to create some sort of contrast because of the narrative. So because we have like an entry point as to why you were even in the simulation to begin with, we have like a real world. So we had to contrast that with the like utopic ideals that we kind of wanted to have for the main simulation. So your real world is like really, you know, red and polluted and stuff like that, and it kind of gives like a reason for the player to go in there, like what are you doing there, why are you doing there, all stuff like that. The image on the far right is because of a key gameplay narrative change, so that the purple type substance, you can't photograph it, and that's like a key gameplay change. So that also had to contrast with like all the levels of this sort of element had to contrast with what we have in the main simulation. And the image at the bottom there with the plants has a more clear idea of what the type of like plants that we're kind of we're using as contrast for the like most of the main simulation versus like when you enter the difficult part of the puzzle stages in the later half of the game. As well, like we have this sort of like broken floating pieces void type thing for the last chapter of the game. So this, even though this sort of aesthetic is really commonly used in a lot of games, like this sort of like broken floating island type of thing, I am pretty happy to say that like at least I think we managed to make the visuals of this last level like fit the narrative as well as like fit the theme. So it's the combination of the player's actions, right? Like my business director said it once, and I think it makes sense. Like in Viewfinder, when you create, you also destroy. So whenever you take a photo and you place that photo, you are destroying part of the original environment with your placed photo. So you are destroying things as you are going through the simulation. But also thematically, like digital data does decay, and this has been left in there for like a really long time. So these are like the remnants of the things and the experiments that the scientists have left behind. So for this, so I think like from those point of view, like we managed to tie everything together. So it makes sense when you arrive at this area and everything's like broken and floating and just falling apart, because that also represents like what you have to, like the choices that you that you have to make at the end of Viewfinder. So these are just like the 2D art of the game. We kind of grouped into different categories. Like things that are in the simulation will look differently than things like in the real world. The stickers icon are just like things for Steam, so they can look very, very different. But for most part, like we try to keep those like things like separate. And then from there to like we have the 4 characters. So a lot of the 2D art here is being used as like tertiary detail to add on and give like more customization to like a lot of the levels. Like each of these characters have their own interests, and like even like the way they draw, like the way they write are very, very different. And we try to do this in some places where we try to show like a conversation going between two different characters just by like the way that they draw, like the way they're thinking about things. Like the engineer is obviously more realistic, so a lot of his stuff is a lot like tighter and like straight lines, whereas the physicist, like she kind of lives in a dreamland, so a lot of her like ideas and designs and stuff like more fantastical and just like you can't build those things. So we didn't really do it too much, but those were like some of the other examples that we were trying to show in the game to de-alienate like some of the spaces. And I mean, when you're making a game, I believe that the team should have some fun. You should have some fun. I believe that like when you're able to clarify like the direction and your team understands the direction, it enables them to have like creative freedom, and they will be able to like have more ownership over their work. So a lot of these like things are from the team having fun, and a lot of them are just like from the team just fooling around with stuff. Like Melanie on the top left, like she came about because our lead artist was just fooling around with props that we're lying around. The cat with the goggles, like we didn't get to put that in, but they came about from like people on the team like sharing pictures of the cat with stuff like. So it's just like stuff like that. Like I think having an element of fun is really important because it is still a video game. Like even though it can be like a serious story or whatever, but you should at least have fun when you're making it because it's a video game. And maybe I think everybody who's working on a game is really familiar with this like series of images. So we have the prototype and then the vertical slice, and hopefully the final game will look amazing. You have like an amazing glow up compared to the prototype. As you might notice, like the bridge puzzle has been there from the beginning since the prototype. So some puzzles we have kept from the beginning, like that, those haven't changed too much. And if you may notice as well, like the core tenets, like the core pillars that we're talking about visually, they haven't really changed too much from the vertical slice to the final game. Like it's still really vibrant. It's still pretty surreal. There's still a lot of like zen, like concrete feelings going around. Like you still feel like it still feels like incredibly like chill and relaxing, which is what I wanted for the art direction. This is our team. This game would not be made without them. They put a lot of hard work to make this happen. So. And we have like honorary art people where they drew fun things for fun, and we also included that in because why not? For this section, I am going to talk about like just some of the biggest challenges that Viewfinder has. So obviously every game has its technical limitations. For example, we don't have characters because we don't have a dedicated character artist. We also have no tech artists because we don't have the budget. Most of our like senior artists and principal programmers, they are our tech artists. They work together to solve like those technical art issues. We also don't have hands, but that's because of a technical as well as like narrative reason. So we don't have the bandwidth to focus on hands specifically, but also if you show hands, it means you define who the player is, and we did not want to do that. We don't want to define who the player is for you. You are the player. Work with your team strengths, like whoever you get is whoever you get, because there's like real life limitations like size and money and all those things. I think something else to think about is I feel like as artists sometimes we always want to push for the best art that we can achieve, but but you can do the best art that you can do, but your game is not going to ship, so it's not going to be experienced by the world. So instead of thinking about like what is the best art that you can achieve, think about what is the minimum that looks good that you can still ship with without overtaxing you or your team. Like having a ship game is a successful game because at least it's out there, as opposed to making something that's beautiful but nobody ever sees it. So yeah, these are just more like technical limitations for Viewfinder. Like there's no LODs, things are fairly like low poly, but we don't have like a strict poly count. Usually one of the more technical people will tell us if we're reaching like a certain point. We have a really powerful main mechanic, which is the slicing mechanic. So basically that is when you take a photo, it will slice, and you place the photo, it will slice through everything in the entire game environment. Like I don't know if you notice here, it actually slices through like the clouds and the background, like mountain, as well as the background vista. So it will literally slice through everything that you can see in the game. So we have to be really careful whenever we place assets and stuff like that, because it would just cut everything straight through. We needed clarity in art, like for the gameplay assets, because it is a puzzle game. People need to understand what they're interacting with. We just use like a really simple like red scheme for all of the puzzle elements, and blue for the difficult challenge ones. Something that's pretty unique about Viewfinder is that because you can slice through everything, we made some like affordable assurances that if people slice through some things, they're able to see the slice through components, which is something that I put under like reasonable expectations. We didn't do it for everything, but we did it for enough things. Like if you cut through anything, you should be able to see what the cross section is, and that cross section should make sense. So you can see like the soil that's in the planter, like stuff like that. This is also something that's pretty unique to Viewfinder, because you can cut everything and you can take a photo of anything. You can create your own bridges and paths to like literally anywhere. We didn't realize this until we saw a couple of play tests where the players were actually climbing on top of like the ceilings and like on top of the buildings, on top of like the platforms, like stuff like that. And as well, like in the first level where you see Kate, you can actually meet Kate early ahead of time if you take a picture and make a bridge to reach Kate in that level. So the stuff like that, and because people are able to travel everywhere, we ended up just like lightly propping the tops of the buildings and platforms and stuff like that, just so that there will be something there, as opposed to leaving it like completely empty. Buildings in general, like there's no windows unless there's an interior inside them, so we kind of want to make that de-alienation clear. Like if there's like a window, there's likely something inside that the players would like to explore. These are some of the tools that we have. They're the most useful art-wise. I would say like we have like the lighting tool, the foliage tool, and the asset browser. So the lighting tool allows us to just change the entire like the color, the hue, and how intense the lighting is in the game. The foliage tool, because Viewfinder uses a lot of like surreal, vibrant imagery, the foliage tool allows the team to change the colors of the plants only, like as a separate element, which is really good when you're trying to create that big picture look. The asset browser, it's it came in useful when we had the 4 characters, and then we were able to just sort out the objects by the characters. So say like for certain chapters it belongs to this character, and then the art team is able to just art it out based on who it is. So there's no like, you don't have to dig around too much. You understand like whose props you're supposed to use or what type of props you're supposed to use. We also have like props that are separate for the purple stuff, like stuff that you can't take pictures of. So we have like a whole separate tab for that, so people could just use that to like kit out and like dress up like their levels instead of like looking around. So the lighting tool itself is probably the biggest tool that is useful for for me personally, because the lighting is like the biggest, I think it's like the biggest memory waste in the game. I think we have something like 8K light maps because of the art direction that we're doing. The lighting has to be baked. It cannot be real time because the slicing mechanic doesn't work at all with real time lighting. So it has to be baked. And then because it's baked and because of the style that we're going, like lighting is really important in a lot of games. Lighting makes or breaks your images, like your visuals. So we put a lot of emphasis into that. And then because we have like a changing palette scheme as you move through the game, it was really important to make sure that the palettes are exactly same for certain chapters, they're the same for certain areas, and then we can tweak them as they want. So what the tool actually allowed me to do is to work a lot more closely with my lead artists. We would have like references like shown on the right there, and we'll be able to just try to like match the reference in the engine with the lighting tool. And then from there, we're sort of able to like, place it around and just do the sort of like pacing to see if those colors like work or not as a whole for certain levels. And then for that too, we're able to do like variations within the level itself, like because there are some like narrative beats, or there's some like a very there are things that require like a change of mood, but we're still keeping like the same overall like palette. So this tool also allows us to do that, because now we have like the set palette and the set colors. We're able to do like minor tweaks, so it still stays within like that palette range, but we're able to like do what we need to do for like for like the narrative beats for the game. We have more than, say, a Viewfinder has more than like 70 discrete levels, because it is a first-person puzzle game. Every level has to be unique. Every layout has to be unique, because all of the puzzles are unique. And on top of that, like I wasn't really sure if we could get enough like people for the team, so I was actually prepared to do this whole game with only like 2 people. So to kind of like solve that, I thought about like using a base kit of prefab pieces, so everybody, and like a base set of like generic props that they could use for any level. So it doesn't matter if we finish the level or not. That was like the minimum bar for dressing for what the level will look like. And then I also made a list of like really hard optionals. Like there are things that we didn't really get to near the end. If we didn't have time, it was completely fine if those were cut. So, but we managed to make those things in. So, for example, like some of the hard optionals were food and clothing. If we didn't get time to make those, it was completely fine with me. We also did a thing where we ordered out the levels and like passes. Like we prioritized like the most important elements first. So that way, even if we didn't get back to it later, most of it was already at like an acceptable level that could be shipped, and it didn't look like really sparse compared to everything else. Like, I would rather aim for like consistency throughout the whole game than having like a certain area be super arted out and super high quality, and the rest of the game like there's like varying levels of quality. Like it's better to have something be consistent than have something be like crazy range of quality. The timeline at the bottom is when the artist got hired, so it was a really tight schedule. So we did what we could. Yeah, and like I guess this is the main question, right? Like how do you even art out these levels if everything is unique with that mechanic? I mean, on the first things first, at its core, these are all just like floating platforms. It's really difficult to make floating platforms interesting. So what we leaned on was like silhouette. The silhouette has to be interesting, and that helped a lot when we made the prefab kit. So you can see here, like without the prefab kit, everything's just like plain blocks. It's really difficult for the artists to like go in and just art out things when like the shape itself was already like really stiff. So there was a lot of like trial and error and just like teaching and encouraging the artists to like push the silhouettes a bit more, like where they could push and stuff like that. It got a lot better with the second one when we had the art kit, and then like our game director was using it to directly like block out the levels. So from that way we could already see like what was he thinking, like where we could push even more, where we could push back, and it was a more like solid foundation to start like some of those discussions as to like how much change the artist can push. Two of the biggest elements here have priority passes. So the blockout layout is basically the concrete prefab pass and the foliage pass. So those two things are the two biggest passes that we have in the game initially. If the game director and myself and narrative, if we don't agree on those passes, then we don't move ahead with the progress of the level. So that's the initial blocker, I guess you would say. As well, like just because this is a puzzle game, like you need to understand what the solution is. You need to understand what the golden pathing is. You need to understand what are some of the possible paths that people will take to solve this puzzle. Everybody has to play through it in first person. We have like a solutions page, and the game director is always there if people are stuck with puzzles. If you understand how to solve the puzzle, then you understand what you need to keep clear versus what you can decorate a bit more. And in certain puzzles too, design will specify things to avoid that we should not be doing just for gameplay purposes. So that helps a lot, helps us out like a lot. So there's like a lot of back and forth here. There's a lot of collaboration here, but the first two big ones are like, I guess maybe three. Like the first one was like have the designers use a consistent kit that everybody else also uses. The second one is like having the initial like big change, the initial like foliage and the block passes. They're the two biggest changes that you can have in a level. And then once those are agreed upon by everybody, then we can go and detail it like a bit more, we can go like detail it like beyond, and we won't need as much like feedback. So here's an example of the process. For the first design block out, just imagine there's no foliage, and then we have like a first pass with the artist who is like changing some things, and then adding like the foliage as intended. And usually in this pass, I would try to encourage them to push it a bit more, so like push the silhouette a bit more, so it looks interesting, so it doesn't like doesn't look too boring. Some of the architecture elements they should be used in specific places because of the way that people build these things. So there's a logic to it that sometimes takes a bit of learning, but eventually they got it. And then refine is when you start to add like the rest of the other, like maybe you have like different plant varieties now. Maybe you add in like more different types of plants, different types of like concrete textures. You start to just add in a lot of the more like granular detail type stuff. And the final like detailing stage is you add in all of the things that were shown earlier, like all of the character specific stuff, like things like electrical panels or like structural panels, like pipes. Like those are all the things that are added like near the end when that your initial like foundation, your initial layout is good, and you're not going to be blocking the player from solving anything, and you're not going to be blocking anything, and not going to be causing bugs. Like people still understand there's a clarity there, but you still have the beauty of the creation of the level. The bottom two are just views from first person. So I tend to look at it from a bigger view, but also look at it for the first person, and just because that's the view that people will see, so you need to evaluate things through that view. And yeah, the changes in gameplay narrative, I think this happens in every project. I don't think it's unavoidable. I don't think it's avoidable. I think there's always going to be like changes throughout the project, but like I said, your foundation should at least be solid. That should not change. Like if your visual pillars are the same and they hold, then even with the changes, you should be able to like react to it and like react to changes in like a doable way. It's not going to be too much of a complete workaround. We had this this purple type element. So this element introduces like you can't take a photograph of it, so it introduces like a higher level of difficulty in Viewfinder. On the bottom left is the initial like animation idea that I threw out there when we were thinking about this sort of like special element, and on the one on the top with Kate is what it looks like in game. So because this material only works really well on like straight edge planes, so even the buildings and architecture stuff that uses this material has to be different. It has to be a lot more straight edge and a lot more blockier than the rest of the stuff that we have in the simulation. But even then, it's like we're able to break the silhouette quite a bit and make the silhouette a bit more interesting through the use of things like structural elements, or like the like the desert type plants that we can use to sort of like break and soften a lot of these like really hard edges. So we had that, and then we had the fifth level where everything is like the final chapter where everything's like chaotic, everything's like broken, right? But so even then it's like you can still see like a lot of things they still keep their really like hard edge, like low poly type shape, but there's still silhouette breakup with some of like the smaller elements that we have used here to break up the bigger pieces. Like we still have the plants, we still have these things we're able to rotate to create that broken field, but still break up the huge like blockiness of like the chunk of like geo that uses this shader. So it's still consistent. There's still like a twist to it in like the last chapter, but you can still visibly recognize it as being part of like the same direction. So and then as we went on with the project, like because we added more levels, a lot of the levels started looking the same. So here is a bit more of like a more granular breakup of things like per chapter. So we still have like concrete and foliage as like our main foundation, like that's like our base level stuff together with the base kit. But this is like it gives a bit more personality, and you help to break up the chapters a bit more just through the introduction of like different percentages of like different material as well as the foliage types. Because foliage is a huge part of the game. They like the different types of foliage and the way we even arrange the foliage can have a really huge impact on like the way the level looks. So, like in 4 and 5, we transition to like a mostly desert type look, and with the purple levels, a lot of the plants are now purple. So we already have like 2 big changes that sort of cement the transition into that chapter. So yeah, these are just some of the things. The special column is just basically like things that will suit the characters basically. So like for example, the artist is of like a Moroccan background, so he will have like a lot of evil eyes in his level to denote his like cultural heritage and things like that. So these are just like some of the little things that you can build up on top of your like your base foundation to create like more variety and like within like your game, but also keep everything consistent because everything is built on top of that initial like foundation that you thought about for your art direction. Yeah, so questions, concerns, snacks. Thank you for listening. Viewfinder is available on PS4, Steam, and PS5. If you haven't heard yet, please do so.